May 15, 1945. The war in Europe had ended only 8 days earlier. At Gluxburg Castle, 3 kilometers north of Flensburg, Germany, a quiet interrogation began that would help shape American strategy for decades to come. The morning was cool and clear. Through the castle's tall windows, the waters of the Flensburg fjord shimmered in pale sunlight. Inside, across a wooden table, 2 men faced each other. One representing the defeated empire of Nazi Germany, the other the ascendant power of the United States. The prisoner was Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, the man who had kept Germany's military machine functioning through 3 years of relentless Allied bombing. At 40, he was calm, perfectly dressed, and strangely composed for a man whose regime had collapsed in ruins. The interrogator was Paul Nitze, 38 years old, a former Wall Street banker turned government strategist, now the vice chairman of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, a team tasked with answering a single critical question. Had strategic bombing worked? Germany's surrender had ended the fighting in Europe, but the Pacific War still raged. Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya lay in ashes, yet Japan fought on. If bombing alone could force surrender, America might avoid a costly invasion that could kill hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Nitze's job was to find out if air power could truly win a war, and Speer, the architect of the German war economy, was the one man who could answer. For 7 days, from May 15th to May 21st, Nitze and his team questioned Speer inside the castle. They met for hours each day, recording everything. To the Americans, Speer was a prize, an industrial genius who had managed to triple German armaments output, while Allied bombs leveled every major city. To Speer, cooperation was survival. He knew the war crimes prosecutors wanted him hanged beside Göring and Himmler. If he made himself useful, if he appeared rational, even decent, perhaps he could live. He chose his words carefully. He would speak freely about factories, weapons, and production figures, but not about slave labor or the Holocaust. That silence, he calculated, might save his life. Speer began his lessons like a lecturer addressing students. When he became armaments minister in February 1942, Germany produced about 15,000 aircraft per year. But Nitze wanted to know how. How could an economy under constant bombardment grow stronger? From 1942 onward, Allied air forces had dropped millions of tons of bombs on German cities. Cologne, Hamburg, Berlin, and Dresden were charred ruins. Yet production climbed. Speer explained the system with cold precision. They dispersed manufacturing into hundreds of smaller workshops scattered across the countryside. They moved vital industries underground, into tunnels and caves. Civilian goods were abolished entirely. Every resource went to war. Factories were designed for redundancy. If one was destroyed, others filled the gap. Forced labor from occupied Europe replaced German workers drafted into the army. Every inefficiency was stripped away. Germany became a nation of machines and slaves, still functioning under fire. Then Speer paused. He mentioned a date, May 12, 1944, and said he would never forget it. On that day, 935 American bombers attacked the synthetic oil plants that powered the Reich, Leuna, Brux, Bleckhammer, and others. The refineries burned for days. That single campaign, he said, was the beginning of the end. Until that moment, the German war machine had survived everything. But oil was different. Germany had no natural petroleum. Every drop of fuel came from synthetic plants that converted coal into gasoline through complex chemical processes. When the bombers destroyed those plants, the heart of the war economy stopped beating. Production of aviation fuel fell from over 300,000 tons in April 1944 to barely 100,000 by July, and less than 50,000 by September. Fighter squadrons could no longer train. Panzer divisions could not move. Jet fighters sat on runways without fuel. Even trucks carrying food to the front ran dry. When Hitler launched the Battle of the Bulge that winter, his generals knew they had barely enough fuel to reach their initial objectives. When American forces held their ground, the offensive collapsed. Not because the tanks were destroyed, but because they simply ran out of gasoline. Speer told Nitze that by late 1944, his factories were producing thousands of aircraft that never flew, and tanks that never left their depots. "You can build all the planes you want," he said, "but without fuel they are useless metal." Nitze pressed for details about earlier raids. The famous 1943 attacks on Schweinfurt's ball-bearing plants, for example. The Americans had suffered horrific losses in those missions. Had they mattered? Speer smiled faintly. "No," he said. "Ball bearings were never the bottleneck the Allies imagined. Germany had substitutes and stockpiles. The bombers had died for little." The same was true of many early precision campaigns. Only when the Americans struck oil, the one resource Germany could not replace, did the bombing become decisive. Nitze took careful notes. That was the insight he needed. Bombing morale or infrastructure had achieved little. Bombing oil had broken the Reich. But as the interrogation continued, another revelation emerged, one that reached beyond bombing strategy into the very nature of modern war. On the third day, Nitze asked Speer what German leaders had understood about American industry before the war. Speer leaned back, thinking. In 1939, he said, Hitler and his generals had dismissed the United States as a divided, decadent nation, rich but soft, still limping from the Great Depression. When Roosevelt promised to build 125,000 aircraft a year, Hitler laughed. German intelligence called those numbers impossible. They were not impossible. They were conservative. In 1941, the United States produced 19,000 aircraft. In 1942, 48,000. In 1943, 86,000. In 1944, 96,000. Germany, at its peak, produced less than half that number. And the Americans were not only arming themselves. Through Lend-Lease, they were supplying Britain, the Soviet Union, and China. By 1944, two-thirds of all Allied military equipment came from American factories. Speer admitted that when he saw those figures in late 1943, he realized the war was already lost. No strategy, no miracle weapon could overcome such disparity. "We could not build fast enough," he said. "Every gain I achieved was cancelled by America's greater gain. German aircraft production might rise by 10,000. America's would rise by 40,000. German shipyards launched submarines. American shipyards launched destroyers faster than submarines could sink them. Liberty ships, 10,000-ton freighters, rolled off American assembly lines in weeks, sometimes days. Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan produced one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. "One bomber an hour," Speer murmured, half in awe, half in despair. Germany's system still depended on skilled craftsmen, not mass manufacturing. Its factories prized precision. America prized quantity. But in a total war of attrition, quantity was quality. For every German fighter lost, the Americans replaced 5. For every tank destroyed, 10 more arrived by ship. The industrial equation made defeat inevitable. Speer told Nitze that by mid-1943, German intelligence knew the truth. Everywhere the tide was turning. In the Atlantic, U-boats were being sunk faster than they could be built. In North Africa, American armies advanced with a torrent of supplies. On the Eastern Front, Soviet offensives were powered by American trucks, food, and fuel. Over Germany itself, the skies filled with endless bomber formations, the physical embodiment of industrial power. He said there was a moment when he considered telling Hitler the truth, that the war was mathematically unwinnable. But he did not. Hitler still believed in wonder weapons, the V-2 rocket, the jet fighter, the idea that one breakthrough could reverse the war. Speer knew better. "You cannot fight arithmetic," he told Nitze. The war was lost when America entered. When Nitze asked why Germany continued fighting, Speer's answer was simple. because surrender was impossible, and truth was forbidden. By the fifth day of interrogation, Nietzsche turned to Hitler's final months. In March 1945, as Allied armies closed in, Hitler issued the Nero Decree, ordering the destruction of all German infrastructure so nothing useful would remain for the victors. Speer claimed he disobeyed, sabotaging the order to preserve what remained of Germany's industry. Whether that was true or self-serving, Nietzsche could not know. But the story would later help Speer at his trial, painting him as a good Nazi, the technocrat who thought of Germany's future rather than Hitler's vengeance. On May 21st, Nietzsche received word that Speer would soon be arrested and turned over for war crimes prosecution. The Americans had less than 2 days. He asked one final question. What had Hitler been like in the end? Speer described his last visit to the bunker in late April. The Führer, he said, was a trembling ruin, raving about betrayal, issuing orders to armies that no longer existed. He still believed that German spirit would overcome American bombs and Soviet tanks. It was madness, Speer said quietly. Willpower does not produce fuel. Faith does not stop bombs. 2 days later, on May 23rd, British and American soldiers surrounded Gluxburg Castle. Speer and the remnants of the so-called Flensburg government were arrested. As they were led away, Speer reportedly said, "So, the end has come. It was all only a kind of opera anyway." He would spend the next 20 years in Spandau prison. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey compiled its findings into hundreds of volumes. Its conclusion was stark. Strategic bombing had not broken German morale. It had not stopped factories by itself. The Germans had endured unimaginable destruction and kept fighting. But the bombing of synthetic fuel plants, the oil campaign, had been decisive. Without fuel, every other weapon was useless. The survey estimated that the oil offensive shortened the war in Europe by several months and saved countless Allied lives. When Nietzsche traveled to Japan later that year to conduct the same analysis after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he saw the same pattern. Japan had been collapsing even before the atomic bombs, strangled by the loss of shipping and fuel. Like Germany, it was dying from economic exhaustion. Modern war, Nietzsche concluded, was a contest of production and resources. The side that could build, transport, and fuel its weapons longer would always prevail. The lessons of Gluxburg shaped Nietzsche's career, and through him, American strategy for half a century. He went on to help design the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Western Europe, authored NSC 68, the blueprint for Cold War containment, and advised nearly every president from Truman to Reagan. The central idea he carried from his interrogation of Albert Speer was simple but profound. Industrial capacity is the foundation of national power. Speer's insights became part of American military doctrine. Future air campaigns, in Korea, in Iraq, would focus on vital resources rather than morale. Yet those lessons were not always remembered. In Vietnam, the U.S. repeated many of the same mistakes, bombing cities and infrastructure instead of the enemy's irreplaceable lifelines. Only in later conflicts did planners rediscover what Nietzsche had learned in 1945, that precision matters less than striking what cannot be replaced: fuel, logistics, and production. At Nuremberg, Albert Speer admitted collective responsibility for the crimes of the Reich, but denied knowledge of the Holocaust. His calm demeanor and apparent remorse distinguished him from the other defendants. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison rather than death. After his release in 1966, he published memoirs that cast him as the repentant technocrat, the good Nazi. His books became bestsellers, and for years the myth endured. Only decades later did hidden documents expose the truth. Speer had known far more than he admitted. He had overseen factories that used tens of thousands of enslaved workers, many from Auschwitz itself. His image as the apolitical architect was a lie carefully built to survive the gallows. Paul Nietzsche lived until 2004, nearly 60 years after that meeting in Gluxburg. His obituary described him as one of the architects of American Cold War policy. It mentioned the strategic bombing survey in passing, but not the conversation that had defined his understanding of power. In that castle room, surrounded by the ghosts of a fallen empire, Nietzsche had heard a confession disguised as analysis. Speer had not only explained how bombing destroyed Germany's oil supply, he had revealed something deeper, that modern warfare is not about courage, ideology, or even tactics. It is about capacity, the ability to produce, to replace, to sustain. Germany lost not because its soldiers were less brave or its scientists less brilliant, but because its factories could not compete with those across the Atlantic. That was the true message of May 1945. The arsenal of democracy had triumphed not merely through strategy, but through scale, a level of industrial output that rendered German valor irrelevant. Speer, the master organizer, had recognized it first. Nietzsche, the analyst, had understood its meaning. Together, in that quiet interrogation room, they articulated the central truth of the 20th century. In an industrial age, war is a test of production. Speer died in 1981 while visiting London. Newspapers eulogized him as the Nazi who said sorry. Survivors of the camps were furious. They remembered the workers he had starved and the lies he had told. History eventually stripped away the illusion, but the conversation he began with Paul Nietzsche remains one of the most revealing exchanges of the post-war world. From the ruins of Germany, Nietzsche carried home a conviction that shaped America's military doctrine, that national security rests not only on armies or weapons, but on factories, supply chains, and economic endurance. Oil, steel, machines. The quiet power behind victory. It was the lesson Speer himself had learned too late. In his final words to Nietzsche, he had summarized it without emotion. "We did not lose the war at the front. We lost it in the factories. You simply built more." That simple truth, spoken in a sunlit room above a cold German fjord, became one of the most important insights of the modern age.